Dust swirled around the cracked pavement as the old truck coughed its last breath, the engine giving one final groan before silence swallowed the rural stretch of road. William Carter stood there, a man out of place in his faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots, staring at the rusted heap he'd deliberately chosen from his company's fleet. He kicked the tire hard, the metallic clang echoing across the empty fields of Brooksville, a nowhere town he'd never heard of until today. 55 years old, CEO of Carter Freight, one of the biggest logistics outfits in the country, and here he was, stranded, sweat beading on his forehead, wondering if the empire he'd built was worth a damn when it couldn't even keep its own wheels turning. He'd always told himself he was a hands-on leader. Started from nothing, he'd say at board meetings, a kid hauling crates in a dusty warehouse back in 1974. But the truth? That was decades ago. Now he lived in a world of glass-walled offices, quarterly reports, and catered lunches. Lately, though, the whispers had gotten louder, drivers griping about long hours, busted equipment, a company that didn't give a rip about the folks who kept it moving. So William had cooked up a plan. Go undercover as Bill, a rookie trucker, and see the cracks for himself. No one would recognize him in this getup. Cap pulled low over his graying hair, hands roughened by a week of prep he'd done in secret. It was supposed to be simple drive a rural route, take notes, get out. But as the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange, and his phone showed no bars, he realized this might not be the cakewalk he'd imagined. The truck was a relic, a rattling beast he'd picked to test the system. Carter Freight prided itself on efficiency, innovation hell. It was plastered all over their website. Yet here he was, bouncing over potholes for hours until the inevitable happened. The engine sputtered, the wheels shook, and now he was stuck miles from anywhere with nothing but a duffel bag and a growing knot in his gut. He climbed out of the cab, the stillness pressing in, broken only by the distant hum of crickets. No cars, no people, just endless rows of corn stretching into the dusk. William slung the bag over his shoulder and started walking, the weight of his decision settling heavier with each step. This wasn't just about a broken truck anymore. It was about everything he'd ignored for too long. About a mile down the road, a flickering neon sign cut through the gloom. Brooksville Diner and Motel. The place looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1980s, peeling paint, fogged windows, a vibe that screamed better days long gone. But it was a lifeline, the only sign of civilization he'd seen since the truck gave up. The bell above the door jingled as he pushed it open, stepping into a haze of warm, greasy air. Behind the counter, a young woman looked up, her tired eyes sparking with a mix of surprise and curiosity. She couldn't have been more than 32, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, a name tag pinned to her apron reading Lori. The weight in those eyes told a story William couldn't place, but it hit him somewhere deep, like a punch he didn't see coming. "You lost?" Lori asked, her voice carrying a faint twang, laced with just a hint of amusement. William forced a grin, dropping his bag by the door. "You could say that. Truck broke down a ways back. Any chance there's a mechanic around?" She shook her head, wiping her hands on a rag. "Closest one's in Millerton, 20 miles east. Old Joe might take a look tomorrow. Thuff's got a shop by the highway." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, the cap now stuffed in his pocket. "Guess I'm stuck here tonight, then." Lori nodded toward a booth by the window. "Sit down. I'll get you some coffee. You look like you need it." He slid into the cracked vinyl seat, the diner's worn charm sinking into him. Faded photos of Brooksville's glory days hung crooked on the walls, old cars, smiling families, a time when this place might have mattered. The smell of bacon and burnt coffee clung to the air, a far cry from the five-star restaurants he was used to. Yet there was something about it, something real, that tugged at a part of him he'd buried under years of profit margins and shareholder calls. Lori came back with a steaming mug and a slice of apple pie, setting it down with a small smile. "On the house. You look like you've had a hell of a day." "Thanks," William said, caught off guard by the gesture. He took a sip, the bitter heat grounding him, and watched as Lori leaned against the counter. They got to talking small stuff at first, the weather, the road. But then she opened up, her voice softening as she spoke. "Been here years now. Ever since my husband passed. Left me with a pile of bills and not much else. This place keeps me going, barely. William's chest tightened, a flicker of guilt he couldn't name stirring inside him. I'm sorry. That's rough. She shrugged, but her eyes held a quiet strength. Got dreams, though. Want to open my own spot someday, a little cafe, you know? Somewhere folks can feel at home. Right now, it's just survival. He listened, nodding, the pie forgotten on the table. Her words painted a picture of resilience he hadn't seen up close in years, not since his own early days scrapping for every dime. She didn't know it, but she was everything his company had failed someone fighting to stand tall while the system kicked her down. As the night stretched on, the diner empty except for them, William found himself sharing bits of his own story carefully edited, of course. He was just Bill, a guy who'd faced his own hard times, not the CEO of a logistics giant. But the more they talked, the more he felt the gap between who he was and who he'd become. Lori offered him a room at the motel next door, and he took it, grateful for the kindness. Lying on the narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, he couldn't shake her voice from his head. The crickets hummed outside, the stars bright above this forgotten speck of a town, and William closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him under. Tomorrow, he'd deal with the truck. But deep down, a question gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. What if this detour wasn't just a breakdown, but a wake-up call? What if Lori's story, those tired eyes and quiet hopes, was about to unravel everything he thought he knew? The morning sun crept over the horizon, spilling pale gold across the patchy fields of Brooksville, but it did little to warm the chill that lingered in William Carter's bones. He'd slept fitfully, the motel's thin mattress creaking under him. Lori's words from the night before looping in his head like a song he couldn't shake. Survival, she'd said. Dreams buried under bills. Now, standing outside the diner with a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, he watched the quiet town stir a wake pickup, trucks rumbling past, a dog barking somewhere down the road. He was supposed to be Bill, the new guy figuring out a busted truck, but the weight of who he really was pressed harder with every passing minute. Joe Miller showed up just after 7, a grizzled figure in grease-stained overalls, his pickup rattling louder than the truck William had left stranded a mile away. Let's see this heap of yours, Joe grunted, barely glancing at him as he tossed a toolbox into the bed of his truck. William followed, the ride to the wreck silent, except for the clatter of tools and Joe's occasional muttering about damn city folks. When they reached the truck, its rusted frame looked even sorrier in the daylight, a relic of Carter Freight's fleet that hadn't seen proper care in years. Joe poked around under the hood, swearing under his breath, while William leaned against the fender, trying to look casual. His stomach churned not just from the delay, but from the realization that this wasn't some fluke. This was his company's failure, staring him in the face. She's patched up, Joe said after an hour, wiping his hands on a rag. Enough to limp to Millert and maybe, don't push her, Thuff's one cough away from the junkyard. William nodded, forcing a thanks through gritted teeth. He wasn't used to this waiting on someone else, stuck at the mercy of a small-town mechanic. Back in the city, he'd have snapped his fingers and had a new rig delivered by noon. Here, he was just Bill, a guy with no pull, and the helplessness gnawed at him like a dull ache. But as he trudged back to the diner, dust kicking up around his boots, he caught sight of Lori through the window wiping down tables. Her movements quick and sure ran something shifted. Maybe this wasn't just a delay. Maybe it was a chance to dig deeper. Inside, the diner smelled of burnt toast and fresh coffee, the breakfast crowd thinning out. Lori glanced up as he slid into his usual booth, her tired eyes softening just a touch. "Joe, fix you up?" she asked, pouring him a refill without waiting for an answer. "Barely," Williams said, managing a half-smile. "Enough to get me out of your hair, I hope." She smirked, leaning a hip against the counter. "You're not the worst stray I've had around here." They fell into easy chatter, the kind that felt natural despite the secrets he was keeping. But then the conversation turned like a gear slipping into place. Lori set down her rag, her gaze drifting to the faded photos on the wall. "My husband used to drive trucks," she said, her voice steady but laced with something heavier. "Long hauls, crazy hours. Worked for Carter Freight, actually, till they cut him loose. William's grip tightened on his mug, the name of his company hitting like a punch to the gut. He kept his face neutral, nodding for her to go on. What happened? They said he screwed up a delivery, she said, her eyes narrowing. Some mix-up with paperwork. Fired him on the spot, no warning, no second chance. Stress got to him after that. He was gone a year later. Heart gave out. 35 years old. Her voice cracked on the last words, and she turned away, busying herself with a stack of menus. I'm sorry, William said, the words feeling small, useless. Guilt clawed at him, sharp and unfamiliar. He'd signed off on policies like that, zero tolerance, efficiency over everything. He'd never thought about the faces behind the numbers, the lives left in the wreckage. Lori shrugged, but the hurt lingered in the air, thick as the grease on the grill. The bell jingled, breaking the tension, and a man stepped in, nearly 40s, weathered face, hands calloused from years on the road. Lori's expression brightened. Tom, didn't expect you today. She introduced him as her brother, another Carter Freight driver, and William's stomach twisted tighter. Tom slid into the booth across from him, sizing him up with a wary look. You the guy with the busted rig? He asked, his voice rough. Yeah, William said, sticking to his alias. Bill, new on the route. Tom grunted, accepting a coffee from Lori. Good luck with that. These trucks are falling apart faster than they can fix them. Company don't care, long as the loads get through. He launched into a litany of complaints: slow pay, endless shifts, bosses who treated them like machines. Made one late drop last month cause a storm. Nearly lost my job over it. They don't give a damn about us. William listened, each word a hammer against the wall he'd built between himself and this world. He wanted to argue, to defend the system he'd created, but the truth was staring him down. Tom's rough hands, Lori's quiet grief. These were the people he'd failed, the ones keeping his empire afloat while he sat in his high-rise office. The coffee went cold in his hands as Tom kept talking, the diner's hum fading into the background. Lori watched from the counter, her arms crossed, and William felt her eyes on him, like she could see through the flannel and the lies. When Tom left, promising to swing by later, the silence settled heavy. Lori walked over, her brow furrowed. You're quiet all of a sudden. Something wrong? William met her gaze, his throat tight. Just thinking about what you said. And Tom, it's not right. What happened to you? To him. She studied him for a moment, then sighed. Yeah, well, it's the way things are. Doesn't mean I've stopped fighting, though. She turned back to the counter, leaving him with the weight of her words and a question he couldn't dodge anymore. Could he keep pretending, knowing what he knew now? Or was it time to face the mess he'd made? Hey, he called after her, his voice low but firm. If you could change one thing about all this, what would it be? Lori paused, glancing back with a flicker of surprise. Justice, she said simply. For people like us. Then she went back to work, leaving William staring into his mug, the steam long gone, wondering if justice was something he could deliver her if he'd just keep running from the truth. Oh, and if any of this hits close to home for you, he said, raising his voice just enough to carry over the clatter of dishes, drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your story. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're rooting for the little guy I know I am. A fly buzzed lazily against the diner's window, trapped between the glass and the world outside, its faint hum blending with the clink of dishes as Lori cleared the last of the lunch rush. William Carter sat in his booth, the cracked vinyl creaking under him, his mind a tangle of half-formed thoughts. The past 2 days in Brooksville had peeled back layers he'd spent years building, years of boardroom bravado, of telling himself Carter Freight was a well-oiled machine. But Lori's story about her husband, Tom's bitter gripes, he'd cracked that illusion wide open. He'd come here to find facts, to poke around as Bill the trucker, but now, with every sip of lukewarm coffee, he felt the weight of something bigger pressing down. The bell above the door jingled, and Tom strode in again, this time with a folder tucked under his arm. He slid into the booth across from William, his jaw tight, eyes darting like he was carrying a secret he couldn't wait to unload. Got something you might want to see, Tom said, his voice low, rough around the edges. He pushed the folder across the table, its edges worn and yellowed. Found it in some old stuff from my brother-in-law Lori's husband. Thought she'd tossed it all, but there it was, shoved in a box. William opened it, his fingers hesitating as he flipped through the paper's pay stubs, route logs, a termination letter from Carter Freight dated 3 years back. His eyes snagged on the reason. Failure to comply with delivery protocol. Standard stuff, the kind of thing he'd seen 100 times. But then he saw the signature at the bottom, scrawled in black ink. William Carter. His own damn name. His breath caught, a cold sweat prickling his neck. He'd signed off on this part of a zero-tolerance policy he'd pushed through in 2021, a cost-cutting move after a rough quarter. He'd never even glanced at the details, just trusted the numbers. Now, those numbers had a face Lori's husband, dead at 35, a heart worn out by shame and stress. "You okay, Bill?" Tom asked, leaning forward, his brow furrowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." William forced a nod, closing the folder with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Yeah, just rough stuff, you know." His voice sounded hollow, even to himself. Tom didn't push, just took the folder back and headed out, muttering something about a late shift. But the damage was done. William sat there, staring at the table, the weight of that signature sinking deeper. He built an empire on efficiency, but at what cost? How many others had he crushed without a second thought? The diner's hum faded as his mind spun, guilt clawing at him like a living thing. Lori came over a few minutes later, wiping her hands on her apron, her tired eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You've been off all day. What's eating you?" He looked up, meeting her gaze, and something snapped inside him. He couldn't keep hiding, not after this. The lie he'd been living as Bill felt like a noose tightening around his neck. He took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "I need to tell you something, Lori. I'm not who you think I am." She froze, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What are you talking about?" "My name's not Bill," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "It's William. William Carter. I'm the CEO of Carter Freight." For a moment, the diner went silent, or maybe it was just in his head. Lori's eyes widened, then narrowed, her face a mix of shock and something darker, something that cut him deeper than he'd expected. "You're kidding," she said, her voice low, trembling. "Tell me this is some sick joke." "It's not," he said, holding her gaze. "I came here undercover to see what's wrong with my company. I didn't know, I swear I didn't tab out your husband. Not until now. But I signed the paper that fired him. I'm the reason he's gone." Lori's hand flew to her mouth, then dropped, her fingers curling into fists. "You destroyed my family," she whispered, the words slicing through him like a blade. She took a step back, her breath hitching, tears glinting in her eyes. "You sat here, listened to me, acted like you cared Ann the whole time. It was you?" "I didn't know," William said, standing, his voice cracking. "I didn't see the people, the lives. But I see it now, Lori, and I want to make it right." "Make it right." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think you could just waltz in here, play the good guy, and fix everything? You don't get it. He's dead because of you, because of your rules, your company. I've been scraping by, barely breathing, while you've been what? Counting your money." Her words hit harder than any boardroom argument, stripping away the last of his defenses. He wanted to argue, to tell her he'd changed things, but the raw pain in her voice stopped him cold. She turned away, shoulders shaking, and he sank back into the booth, his head in his hands. This was the breaking point, the moment he couldn't unsee. He'd come to Brooksville looking for cracks in his company, but what he'd found was a mirror, reflecting a man he didn't recognize anymore. When Lori came back, her eyes were red but dry, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "Why tell me now?" she asked, her voice flat. "What's the point?" "Because I can't keep lying," he said, looking up at her. "And because you deserve better. I'm offering you a job remote, good pay, something to get you out of this grind. And I'm going to fix Carter Freight, starting with the drivers. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm asking you to let me try." She stared at him, her expression unreadable, the air between them thick with unspoken things. "I need to think," she said finally, turning away again. "Just leave me alone for now." William nodded, watching her disappear into the kitchen. The diner felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in as he sat there, alone with the wreckage of his choices. He'd laid it all bare: his name, his guilt, his promise, but the look in Lori's eyes lingered, a question he couldn't answer yet. Would she give him a chance to prove he'd changed, or had he just torched the only bridge he'd built in this nowhere town? The air outside the Brooksville diner hung heavy with the promise of rain, gray clouds rolling and slow and thick, mirroring the storm brewing inside William Carter's chest. He stood by the motel's sagging porch, hands shoved deep in his pockets, replaying Lori's words from yesterday: "You destroyed my family," each syllable a fresh cut. She'd walked away after he'd spilled the truth, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her anger and a half-baked offer she hadn't even acknowledged. He'd bared all: his name, his guilt, his plan to fix things, but her silence screamed louder than any rejection. Now, with the truck patched up enough to limp back to the city, he had a choice: run back to his glass tower or stay and face the mess he'd made. Inside the diner, Lori moved like a ghost, wiping counters, pouring coffee, avoiding his gaze every time he dared step through the door. He tried talking to her again that morning, leaning on the counter with a quiet, "Lori, please, just hear me out." She'd cut him off, her voice sharp as a knife. "I said I need time, Billy or William, or whatever the hell you are. Back off." The sting of it lingered, but he couldn't blame her. He'd dropped a bomb on her life, and now the fallout was hers to sift through. Still, her refusal hit harder than he'd expected, unraveling the thin thread of hope he'd clung to. He'd thought confessing would lighten the load, but it only piled on more doubt, shame, the sinking fear that he couldn't undo what he'd done. Back in the city, the clock was ticking. He'd been gone 3 days, long enough for his assistant Claire to start blowing up his burner phone with messages about board meetings and quarterly reviews. Carter Freight wasn't going to wait for him to figure out his soul-searching. He climbed into the truck, the engine sputtering to life with a reluctant growl, and drove the 20 miles to Millerton for a proper fix. The mechanic, the wiry guy named P, took one look at the rig and whistled. "This thing's a lawsuit waiting to happen. Your boss ought to be ashamed." William forced a laugh, muttering something about big companies, but Pete's words stuck like burrs. By the time he rolled back into Brooksville that afternoon, the truck running smoother but his mind a wreck, he knew he couldn't keep dodging the inevitable. Lori was outside when he pulled up, sweeping the diner's steps with short, angry strokes. She glanced at him, her jaw tight, then went back to her work. William cut the engine and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. "I'm heading back tomorrow," he said, keeping his distance. "But I meant what I said, Lori. The job's yours if you want it. And I'm not stopping there. I'm going to change things at Carter Freight. For you, for Tom, for everyone." She stopped sweeping, her hands gripping the broom like it was the only thing holding her together. "You think a job fixes this?" she snapped, turning to face him. "You think I can just forget what you took from me? My husband's gone, William. No paycheck's bringing him back." "I know that," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't fix the past, but I can damn well make sure it doesn't happen again, not to you, not to anyone else." She stared at him, her eyes blazing, then shook her head. "You don't get to play hero now. I don't want your pity or your promises. I want you gone." She turned and stormed back inside, the door slamming shut behind her. William stood there, the rejection hitting like a freight train, his hands curling into fists. He'd laid his cards on the table, and she'd shoved them right back in his face. For a moment, he felt the old instinct kick in, cut his losses, climb into the truck, drive away. But then he saw her through the window, head bowed over the counter, and the fight drained out of him. He couldn't leave like this, not yet. The drive back to the city the next day was a blur of highways and gas station coffee, the truck rattling under him like a reminder of everything he'd let fall apart. When he walked into Carter Freight's gleaming headquarters, the contrast hit him: hard-polished floors, hushed voices, the sterile hum of wealth. Claire was waiting in his office, her usual calm fraying at the edges. "Mr. Carter, where have you been? The board's been asking." "Call a meeting," he cut in, his tone sharp. "Now, and give me every report we've got on driver conditioned wages, hours, grievances. All of it." She blinked, thrown by the fire in his voice, but nodded and scurried out. William sank into his chair, the weight of Brooksville pressing down on him, Lori's tears, Tom's calloused hands, that damn termination letter with his name on it. He'd come back with a plan: higher pay, better rigs, a system that didn't chew people up and spit them out. But when the board filed in an hour later, their suits crisp and their faces skeptical, the air turned thick with resistance. "This is insane," one of them said, a gray-haired exec named Hargrove, jabbing a finger at William's proposal. "You're talking millions new trucks, raises, benefits? We'll tank our margins." "We've been tanking people's lives," William shot back, standing at the head of the table. "I've seen it, drivers working themselves to death, rigs falling apart. We're bleeding talent because we treat them like dirt. This isn't just business, it's right." The room erupted, voices overlapping, cost projections, shareholder value, the same old song. William held his ground, his voice rising over the chaos. "I signed off on a man's firing 3 years ago. He's dead now. Hart gave out from the stress. That's on me, on us. We don't change, we're just digging more graves." The argument dragged on, Hargrove's face red, others shifting uncomfortably. By the end, they'd budged, just barely agreeing to a pilot program, a fraction of what he'd wanted. William left the room drained, his tie loosened, defeat settling in his gut. He'd fought, but it wasn't enough, not yet. Back in his office, he stared out at the city skyline, the lights blurring as Lori's words echoed again. "You don't get to play hero." Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd failed her all over again. But then an idea sparked, faint but stubborn. He grabbed his phone and dialed Claire. "Give me contact info for every driver we've got, past and present. And pull the records on Lori Hayes' husband. I'm not done fighting this." As he hung up, the rain finally broke outside, streaking the windows, and William felt a flicker of something: hope, maybe, or just sheer defiance. Could he turn this mess around, or was he just chasing a ghost? Rain tapped a steady rhythm against the windows of Carter Freight's towering headquarters, the city lights smearing into streaks of gold and gray as night settled over the skyline. William Carter sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of files, driver records, grievance logs, the messy truth of his company laid bare. The past week had been a blur of late nights and hard calls, ever since the board meeting left him with a half win and a gnawing ache. Lori's rejection still burned, her voice, "You don't get to play hero," a constant prod at his conscience. But out there in Brooksville, staring at that busted truck and her tired eyes, something had shifted. He wasn't the man who'd signed off on her husband's firing anymore, not entirely. And tonight, he was damn well going to prove it. He'd spent days digging through the data Claire had pulled, piecing together a case that couldn't be ignored. Stories like Lori's husband weren't one-offs. Drivers pushed past breaking points. Families left scrambling when the axe fell. William had always prided himself on building something big, something lasting, but now he saw the cracks: profit over people, a legacy built on sand. The realization settled slow and heavy, like the rain outside, and from it grew a quiet resolve. He wasn't just fighting for Lori or Tom anymore. This was about every name in those files, every life he'd let slip through the gaps. He straightened his tie, grabbed his revised proposal, and called Claire. "One more board meeting. Tomorrow. Make it happen." The next day, the conference room buzzed with tension, the board members filing in with guarded looks. Hargrove, the loudest skeptic from last time, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "This better be good, Carter. We're not here for another sermon." William didn't flinch. He stood at the head of the table, the projector flickering to life behind him, and laid it all out: hard numbers, harder stories. He talked about Lori's husband, about the termination letter with his signature, about the drivers still out there grinding through 16-hour days on rigs that barely ran. His voice rose, steady but fierce. "We've got a choice: keep bleeding people dry, or build something worth a damn. I'm done burying our mistakes." Hargrove opened his mouth to argue, but William cut him off, slamming a stack of driver testimonies on the table. "Read these. Then tell me we can't afford this." The room went quiet, the weight of those pages sinking in. It wasn't a landslide. Hours of back and forth followed, voices sharp, tempers flaring, but by the end, they caved. Full approval, better wages, new trucks, a grievance system that actually worked. William walked out, his shirt damp with sweat, a small, tired smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't everything, not yet, but it was a start, a real one. Back in his office, he dialed Lori's number, his heart thudding as it rang. She picked up on the third try, her voice wary. "What now, William?" "It's done," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The board signed off. Changes are coming, pay, conditions, all of it. Your job offer's still there too. I just wanted you to know." A long pause stretched between them, the line crackling faintly. "Why should I believe you?" she asked, softer this time. "You don't have to," he said. "Not yet, but I'm not stopping till I prove it." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry, Lori, for everything. I can't bring him back, but I can make sure no one else goes through what you did." She didn't reply right away, and when she did, her voice was steady but guarded. "Send me the details. I'll think about it." She hung up, leaving him with a flicker of hope, fragile, but there. A week later, the formal offer went out, and to his surprise, she accepted remote work, good pay, a lifeline out of the diner's grind. But there was a catch, a note attached to her acceptance, short and sharp. "Don't think this means I trust you. Keep your word." That note sat on his desk now, a reminder as he stared out at the rain-soaked city. Weeks passed, and the changes rolled out, drivers texting Claire about new rigs, Tom calling to say he'd gotten a raise. One evening, as William sifted through reports, Claire knocked and stepped in, her expression odd. "Someone's here for you." Before he could ask, Lori walked through the door, her simple jacket out of place in the sleek office, her eyes carrying that same quiet strength he'd seen in Brooksville. "Lori," he said, standing caught off guard. "What are you doing here?" "Had to see it for myself," she said, crossing her arms. "The changes you promised. Figured I'd check if you're full of hot air." He smiled, gesturing to the chair across his desk. "Sit. I'll show you." For the next hour, he walked her through it, new policies, driver feedback, the slow shift in the company's soul. She listened, asked questions, her skepticism thawing just enough to notice. As she stood to leave, she paused. "My husband didn't just die from stress. He blamed himself for that firing. Thought he'd let me down. I never told you that." William's throat tightened, the micro twist hitting like a gut punch. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry." She nodded, her gaze steady. "Keep doing this, making it right. That's all I've got to say." She left, the door clicking shut, and William sank back into his chair, the weight of her words settling in. He'd started this journey, stranded by a broken truck, a man disconnected from the world he'd built. Now, with Lori's story and a company starting to heal, he was finding his way back, not to the top, but to something truer. The rain eased outside, a faint glow breaking through the clouds. William thought about that first day in Brooksville, the dust and the busted tire, and how far he'd come. One man's journey had shifted countless lives, but what about yours? If you've ever had to fight for what's right, he'd say if he were talking to you now. Tell us in the comments. What would you do in my shoes? Thanks for sticking with this story, he'd add, his voice warm through the screen. Hit that like button if it moved you. Subscribe for more tales like this, and drop a comment. We read every one. Check out our next video for another journey worth taking. See you soon.